What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my DFS picks for NFL Week 15. Sleepers and studs.
These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to give you a sleeper pick and my favorite stud at each position.
And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made.
Okay guys, Week 15, let's take a look at the quarterback position. So my top DFS stud at the quarterback position is Lamar Jackson from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the second most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Lamar Jackson has averaged 22.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10.4 rush attempts per game. He's playing inspired football in desperation mode. He scored 38 and 27 fantasy points in the last two games, and he got 9 and 13 rush attempts in those games. He's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 23.3 fantasy points here in Week 15. He's $7,500 DraftKings salary and $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, and they have the Ravens favored by 12.5. So fantastic matchup. This is a game the Baltimore Ravens have to win. I think Lamar Jackson puts this game on his back, so I like Lamar Jackson here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. The other stud that I like here this week is Tom Brady from the Tampa Bay Bucks playing the Atlanta Falcons, who have the sixth worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Tom Brady has averaged 21.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 16, 27, and 15 fantasy points in the last three games, and he's going to be about 9% owned, projected at 23.9 fantasy points here in Week 15. He's $6,600 DraftKings salary and $1,300 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49.5 points scored in this game, with the Tampa Bay Bucks favored by 6. So fantastic matchup. This is a game Tom Brady has to win, so I like Tom Brady here versus the Atlanta Falcons. Okay, my sleeper pick at the quarterback position is Kirk Cousins from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Chicago Bears, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing quarterbacks. Kirk Cousins has averaged 19.8 fantasy points per game on the season, and he scored 18, 26, and 30 fantasy points in the last three games, and he's only going to be about 1% owned, projected at 17.2 fantasy points here in Week 16, and he's $6,100 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game, with the Vikings favored by 3, but the Chicago Bears have a good run defense, so that may force Kirk Cousins to pass the ball, so I like Kirk Cousins here versus the Chicago Bears. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. My running back stud is Derrick Henry from the Tennessee Titans playing the Detroit Lions, who have the second worst defense overall, and they give up the absolute most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Derrick Henry has averaged 22.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 22.9 rush attempts per game and 2.2 pass targets per game. So monster rushing volume. He's going to be about 17% owned, projected at 23.4 fantasy points here in Week 16. He's $9,500 DraftKings salary and $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Tennessee Titans favored by 11. So you have a fantastic matchup, a high-scoring game, and a running game script. This guy has some of the biggest upside in all of fantasy football. So I like Derrick Henry here versus the Detroit Lions. Okay, my sleeper pick at the running back position is Gus Edwards from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the fourth most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Gus Edwards has scored 18 and 13 fantasy points in the last 2 games off of 7 rush attempts in each of those games. Now, he's projected at 7.3 fantasy points here in week 15, and he's only going to be about 1% owned. But he's only $4,400 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel, so I like that DraftKings price. And we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Baltimore Ravens favored by 12.5. So fantastic matchup. This should be a running game script. Gus Edwards could get between 7 and 12 carries in this game, and it looks like they're using him around the goal line. So I like Gus Edwards here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL. NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. My wide receiver stud is DeAndre Hopkins from the Arizona Cardinals playing the Philadelphia Eagles, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. DeAndre Hopkins has averaged 19.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.8 pass targets per game. He's going to be about 14% owned, projected at 18.6 fantasy points here in week 15. He's $7,900 DraftKings salary and $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, with the Cardinals favored by 6. So you got a middle-of-the-pack matchup here, but DeAndre Hopkins has scored 26, 19, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 11, 13, and 7 pass targets. So tons of passing volume, excellent production. So I like DeAndre Hopkins here versus the Philadelphia Eagles. Okay, my wide receiver sleeper pick is Darnell Mooney from the Chicago Bears playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Darnell Mooney has averaged 8.3 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.6 pass targets per game. He scored 11, 8, and 8 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 2, 6, and 9 pass targets. He's going to be about 2% owned, projected at 8.7 fantasy points here in week 15, but he's only $3,900 DraftKings salary and $1,400 more on FanDuel. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game. The Chicago Bears trailing by 3. So fantastic matchup. Could be a passing game script. So I like Darnell Mooney here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. My tight end stud is Mark Andrews from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Jacksonville Jaguars, who have the absolute worst defense overall, and they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Mark Andrews has averaged 12 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. He scored 13 fantasy points last game off of 6 pass targets. He's going to be about 11% owned, projected at 14.2 fantasy points here in week 15, and he's only $5,500 DraftKings salary and $1,300 more on FanDuel. So I love that DraftKings price. So we know Vegas thinks there's going to be 47.5 points scored in this game, with the Ravens favored by 12.5. Fantastic matchup here. And if you watched the Ravens last game, you can see Mark Andrews was one of the primary targets. I think that continues here into the game versus Jacksonville Jaguars. He's got a great matchup. I think he could be a slate breaker at only $5,500 DraftKings salary. So I like Mark Andrews here versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Okay, and my sleeper pick at the tight end position is Jared Cook from the New Orleans Saints playing the Kansas City Chiefs, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Jared Cook has averaged 8.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.8 pass targets per game. But take a look at his last 2 games. He scored 13 and 12 fantasy points off of 4 and 5 pass targets. He's only going to be about 2% owned, projected at 7.5 fantasy points here in week 15, and he's $3,400 DraftKings salary and $2,200 more on FanDuel. So Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Saints trailing by 3. So great matchup here, high scoring game, a passing game script, and I like that he's gotten 4 and 5 pass targets in the past 2 games, and he's been productive. So I think it makes him a sneaky sleeper pick here. So I like Jared Cook here versus the Kansas City Chiefs.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video, or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.